Many other.
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks, and in this bulletin we'll get you updates on stories developing around the world with, of course, an intense focus on Afghanistan. First, all the day's top headlines. Former Afghan President Hamid Karzai meets a senior Taliban leader and the Haqqani network's Anas Haqqani in Kabul for talks. The former government's peace envoy Abdullah Abdullah is also present at the meeting. The Afghan embassy in Tajikistan removes Ashraf Ghani's portrait and replaces it with Amarullah Saleh's picture after he declares himself the president of Afghanistan following Ghani's flight from the country. Three people are killed and dozens injured after the Taliban opened fire at protesters in the Afghan city of Jalalabad. The demonstrators were demanding the reinstallation of Afghanistan's flag on offices instead of the Taliban's flag.
And by its actions rather than by its words.
The House of Commons in London reconvenes for a debate on the situation in Afghanistan. Some members agreeing with Prime Minister Boris Johnson that the UK should judge the Taliban based on its actions and not its promises, and others slamming US President Joe Biden. More than 2,200 diplomats and other civilians have been evacuated from Afghanistan on military flights as efforts gather pace to get people out after the Taliban seized Kabul. Civilian flights, however, remain suspended. And in other news, the western United States continues to battle an historic drought. The dry weather has now sparked water shortages in 10 American states. We begin today with Joe Biden. Around the world, there is growing anger over the crisis in Afghanistan and growing claims that the United States president badly miscalculated the immediate implications of America's military withdrawal from the country. A crisis thousands of miles away is now battering the US president. As the Taliban made its final push in Afghanistan, Biden was holed up at his Camp David presidential retreat. Last night, he returned to the White House facing record low approval ratings, a stunning 7 percentage point drop in just 72 hours. The Reuters Ipsos poll suggests only 46% of Americans now approve of Biden's performance in office. Just before the fall of Kabul, that figure stood at 53%. Two other surveys have recorded similar numbers. In Congress, lawmakers, including many Democrats, are furious about the crisis in Afghanistan. They've launched a probe over the US withdrawal, with hearings due to begin next week in the House of Representatives. They'll also look into the negotiations that took place between former President Donald Trump's administration and the Taliban. Republicans want current Secretary of State Antony Blinken to testify. This to understand why the US State Department was so ill-prepared for the events of the last few days. Bob Menendez, the Democratic chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said the events of recent days have been the culmination of a series of mistakes made by Republican and Democratic administrations over the past 20 years. In his Monday speech after the Taliban took power in Kabul, Joe Biden acknowledged that the group overcame Afghan forces far more rapidly than he had expected. But the US was aware that its hasty withdrawal from the war-torn country could lead to a Taliban takeover eventually, with some intelligence estimates here reportedly saying the process would take between 6 and 18 months. In a matter of days, of course, the Taliban has effectively wiped away 2 decades of US military presence in Afghanistan. They cost trillions of dollars of taxpayer money and thousands of American lives. The Taliban is also now in control of large amounts of military equipment and technology, abandoned by Afghan forces but supplied to them by the Americans. Back in 2001, President George W. Bush ordered US forces to invade Afghanistan. 20 years later, fellow Republicans say the security and humanitarian crisis unfolding in the country could have been avoided if the military withdrawal had not been rushed. For more on all of this, let's cross live now to WION's correspondent Susan Tehrani, who joins us from New York. Susan, in the last 24 hours, the heat on President Biden seems only to be intensifying, accompanied now by these opinion polls and surveys that show his approval rating falling. This is now, is it not, a full-blown crisis for the US president?
No doubt. It's hard to believe how Joe Biden really wants to get out of this one, considering the fact that in his own words, the buck stops with him. As he mentioned earlier in his speech, one of the main aspects of this drop in approval ratings is the over 11,000 Americans that are stuck in Afghanistan with no guarantee that they'll be coming out anytime safe, and the U.S. administration acknowledging the fact that there is no guarantee for them to come out, and now this administration trying to figure out whether or not to send in U.S. troops into these residential areas in Kabul and other places in Afghanistan to bring them to the airport or take control of the airport. And this debacle is really being played out on the media in front of the American public less than a month to September 11th, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And you can imagine how that affects Americans watching and seeing how this all of this is unfolding. And as you mentioned, all across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats in Washington are once again wondering why Joe Biden is still adamant on pressing for this hasty withdrawal and sticking to the August 31st complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. It is a full-blown crisis, and it's hard to believe how the Biden administration wants to continue to justify its decision.
Yeah, absolutely. A full-blown crisis that, as you were saying, Susan, is by no means over yet, because it's not immediately clear at all how the Biden administration is going to evacuate even the more than 10,000 American citizens in Afghanistan, and then, of course, the tens of thousands of Afghans who have assisted American forces over the last 20 years, given the very fluid security situation outside the airport. But let's talk a little bit about the international impact of all of this on Joe Biden. There is fury in many world capitals. The Australians very angry about the risk at which Australian citizens have been placed in Afghanistan. Anger today being expressed towards Joe Biden in the House of Commons in London. Even the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg indicating that the onus is very much now on the US to make sure that these repatriation efforts succeed. I mean, Joe Biden was viewed around the world before all of this began as the competent one. He was the relief to the lack of competence that many world leaders saw in Donald Trump. This has got to make life in the months ahead for President Biden very complicated on the world stage.
Exasperated by the fact that just a few months ago, and it seems like yesterday, when Joe Biden stood on the world stage and said America is back, quote unquote. And and to watch American allies just sit in shock and awe for a president that really boasted on his at least experience on foreign policy issues, and for a majority of Americans to really vote on that issue of foreign policy is something of a wonder to watch. And I think that at the end of the day, once again going back to the quote of the buck stops with me, I think a lot of American allies are also pointing to the fact that this was a U.S.-led mission at the end of the day, and partners of the United States could not stay in Afghanistan beyond a U.S. mandate. And when they're being questioned on whether or not how they're going to handle the situation on Afghanistan, for example, the NATO chief said that, this was a negotiation going on last year between the United States and the Taliban, and they agreed for a U.S. troop withdrawal, and then we agreed, to pull our forces out of Afghanistan as well. But it's a dire situation not only for the alliance with the United States right now regarding Afghanistan, but how U.S. allies are going to interact with the United States moving forward on the world stage, and whether or not they can count on the United States and vice versa when and if there is a rising threat of extremism or any other threat moving forward, and the United States is going to reach out and ask for alliance's help. I mean, these are questions that need to be answered. And then, of course, the immediate one regarding Afghanistan. Uncertain future, and again, it's really difficult to understand how the Biden administration wants to get out of this one.
Absolutely. Susan Tehrani, WION's correspondent, live for us today in New York. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme. So the days ahead are going to be very nervous ones for the Biden administration after the president insisted that the US military only has until August the 31st to evacuate thousands of Americans from Afghanistan and at-risk Afghans who supported US operations there. The Pentagon is aiming to evacuate 22,000 special immigrant visa applicants, their families and other vulnerable people. Officials and refugee resettlement groups say that target will be enormously difficult to reach now that the Taliban has taken over control and surrounds the airport, despite White House claims here yesterday that the Taliban has pledged safe passage for those people trying to reach the airfield. The hope is to fly up between 5,000 and 9,000 people per day when the Pentagon reaches full capacity with 6,000 troops on the ground in Kabul. So far, only 4,000 troops have reached the Afghan capital.
The U.S. military restarted flights evacuating diplomats and civilians from Afghanistan on Tuesday, a day after chaotic scenes at Kabul airport, where thousands desperate to flee following the Taliban's sudden takeover had crowded the runway, which has since been cleared.
The speed of evacuation will pick up.
Army Major General William Taylor said the U.S. could evacuate 5,000 to 9,000 people from Kabul per day if conditions at the airport remain stable.
There have been discussions, there is communication.
And Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said U.S. military commanders were communicating with Taliban leaders to avoid hostilities at the airport, the only way to fly in or out of the country.
Just suffice it to say that our commanders there at the airport are charged with securing that airport and keeping it secure. And they will and should have whatever interactions they believe are necessary to accomplish that mission.
U.S. forces took charge of the airport on Sunday as the Taliban wrapped up a week of rapid advances by taking over Kabul without a fight. General Taylor said a total of 4,000 American troops would be at the airport by the end of the day, an increase of 1,000, with the aim of having one flight taking off per hour. U.S. military officials have said they believe that between 5,000 and 10,000 U.S. citizens remain in the Kabul area, where tens of thousands more Afghan citizens also wished to escape.
The US Air Force has launched an investigation into how civilians were killed at Kabul airport. Bone-chilling videos show desperate attempts by Afghans to cling on to planes taking off. Investigators are reviewing footage of what appears to be two Afghans falling from an airborne C-17. More disturbing footage has come to light that shows the bodies of those who fell from the aircraft. The US Air Force has acknowledged that human body parts were found in the wheel well of a C-17 cargo plane that took off amid chaotic scenes at Kabul airport. The body was found after the aircraft landed in Qatar. An investigation has been launched into the incident. It is not known exactly how many people have been killed and injured. The US Air Force spokesperson Anne Stefanik said the examination will be thorough to ensure facts are obtained regarding the tragic incidents. Before the aircrew could offload the cargo, the aircraft was surrounded by hundreds of Afghan civilians who had breached the airport perimeter. Faced with rapid deteriorating security situation around the aircraft, the C-17 crew decided to depart the airfield as quickly as possible. The Taliban's top political leader and co-founder, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, has returned to Afghanistan after over a decade. Baradar, the chief of the Taliban's political office, arrived in Kandahar today along with a delegation. A video showed him and his colleagues disembarking from a C-17 aircraft at Kandahar airport. He arrived from Qatar, where he spent months leading talks with the United States and negotiators from the former Afghan government. Abdul Ghani Baradar is the Taliban's top political leader, and he was the organization's chief negotiator in Doha. He helped his former commander in the anti-Soviet resistance movement establish the Taliban back in the mid-1980s. In 2010, he was arrested in Pakistan, where he was held for 8 years. He was released from prison 3 years ago at the request of former US President Donald Trump's administration so that he could participate in peace talks. Last year, Baradar became the first Taliban leader ever to communicate directly with a US president when he spoke with Donald Trump over the phone shortly after signing an initial agreement to end the conflict. With Kabul almost entirely in Taliban hands and President Ashraf Ghani having fled the country, Baradar has emerged as Afghanistan's new de facto leader. Moving on now from the Afghanistan crisis, the drought in the western United States is worsening. It first hit water supplies and food production. Now it's threatening the electricity supply. This as record low water levels in reservoirs have hit hydropower plants. On your screen is a visual of the Edward Hyatt power plant. It is California's largest hydroelectric plant. It's been shut since August the 5th as Lake Orville's reservoir sank to an historic low. This is the first time that the plant ever had to be shut due to a lack of water. 80,000 homes and businesses are at risk of power outages. The dry weather has also affected hydroelectric plants serving California, Nevada, and Arizona.
In an average year, California gets about 15% of its electricity from hydropower, from hydroelectric dams. When you have a drought year, the reduction in stream flow directly affects how much hydropower you can generate.
The situation remains dire. At least 10 states have been affected. They are Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the US in terms of its water capacity, so naturally record low levels in the water body mean that several states now face water shortages. The worst hit states include Arizona and Nevada. The drying up of the Colorado River on which this reservoir was built means that even Mexico will now be affected.
We are seeing the effects of climate change in the Colorado River Basin through extended drought, extreme temperatures, expansive wildfires, and in some places flooding and landslides. And now is the time to take action to respond to them. The basin is experiencing its 22nd year of drought, and earlier this summer, the reservoirs hit their lowest levels since they were originally filled.
Farmers are among the worst hit. They are fearing a loss of income as the water shortage hits crop production.
Because of the Colorado River cutbacks, we're losing a large portion of our water, and specifically on the stuff I manage, we're losing about half our deliverable water potentially next year, so gonna have to cut back on a lot of acres that we're having production right now.
The western US is a dry region and it has not experienced ample rainfall over the past few weeks. Scientists warn, though, that droughts are now becoming more frequent, and that's a clear indication, they say, climate change is at play. The American state of California is the world's largest producer of almonds. 70% of the produce is exported to India, East Asia and Europe, although almond milk has now become extraordinarily popular right here in the United States. But this year, let alone exports, the industry is struggling even to fill domestic demands amid that historic drought.
California's reliable irrigation system had made it the perfect destination to grow almond, which is a water-intensive crop. But now, the farmers have begun abandoning their orchards as the region faces a water shortage amid a drought in western United States. Many of them are unable to afford water. Some have left their trees to die, while others are leaving fields uncultivated to save water.
So we're going to see a slight reduction in the amount of almonds coming out of California, which the world's going to start to see less almonds.
California is the world's top almond producer. In fact, it produces 80% of the world's almonds. This industry is worth $6 billion. As almond prices rose across the world, many farmers invested in orchards without keeping the environmental factors in mind. This meant that fields lacked reliable water supplies. The nut needs water throughout the year.
We have about 600 acres of almonds on our farm, and currently the orchards are being in deficit irrigation. That means that the trees are not getting the amount of water they should get.
The government's reaction has added to the farmers' woes. Authorities have cut down on water supplies meant for agriculture. As drought drains the state's reservoirs, the government has asked residents to voluntarily reduce their water usage by 15%.
So water in California is really messed up. I think with the climate change, the drought, the heat waves we're having, something's going to change very quickly, or we're going to literally see our state collapse. So we need to do something about it.
With little help forthcoming from the officials, farmers now fear that many orchards won't survive the drought. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Shops closed, offices shut and city streets deserted. New Zealand returned to life in a lockdown for the first time in 6 months. Strict restrictions were imposed in a bid to halt any spread of the contagious Delta variant of COVID-19. A snap 3-day nationwide lockdown was imposed after a single case suspected to be Delta was found in New Zealand's largest city of Auckland.
New Zealand's city streets were largely deserted Wednesday morning as the country returns to life under lockdown. After months of living virus-free, New Zealand confirmed its first case of the highly contagious Delta variant in Auckland on Tuesday. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said Wednesday there were now at least 10 confirmed cases, including a fully vaccinated nurse from Auckland Hospital. She added that they are all linked to an original infection from just across the water.
The second thing it tells us is that it has linked the current genome sequencing of cases in the New South Wales outbreak. Our case has originated in Australia.
Most of the country will be under level 4 lockdown, the highest alert level for at least 3 days, while Auckland will stay under lockdown for a week. Panic buying erupted after it was announced on Tuesday, while schools and businesses scrambled to move online. New Zealand's last reported community case of COVID-19 was in February. Its citizens have been living without restrictions, although its borders remain largely sealed. Ardern has been praised for New Zealand's strict virus containment measures, but her popularity took a hit with the delayed vaccine rollout. Only a fifth of the country's 5 million people have been fully vaccinated so far.
Just before we go today, a little bit of breaking news coming from the United Arab Emirates. The UAE's foreign ministry says it can confirm that former Afghan President Ashraf Ghani is now in the United Arab Emirates. They say they have welcomed President Ashraf Ghani and his family into the country on humanitarian grounds. So that certainly appears to solve the mystery of the whereabouts of the Afghan leader, who of course fled as the Taliban closed in on Kabul. That is all we have for you today on WION's live broadcast from Washington, D.C. For more global news and continuing updates about Afghanistan, stay tuned to WION World is Live.
There are many other...
This is right, Arab.